I'm Professor David Wilson. As a criminologist, I'm often asked, what's it like to interview a serial killer?
This is a tape-recorded interview. Date is 11/17/84.
In this new series, I'm going to take you on a journey into the dark heart of the police interrogation room. Using cutting-edge lip-sync technology, we'll bring to life the actual taped confessions of some of the world's most notorious murderers.
Put that pillowcase or whatever it looks like, cushion cover over her head.
And bring you face to face with evil.
Put her into the sleeping bag. No, I just slung her in the corner.
And along with forensic psychologist Professor Michael Brooks, I will analyse their interviews in unparalleled detail.
And while he was asleep, I put a noose around his neck. I throttled him with the noose and he hardly struggled.
Like the police detectives who interviewed them, you'll experience firsthand their cold and calculating minds.
I've never gotten with women. I knew that she favoured my sister more than me.
Their wicked words, now seen being spoken for the very first time, will never be forgotten.
The Hawkins girl's head was severed and taken up the road about 25 to 50 yards.
The British serial killer whose confession we examine in this episode frankly needs little introduction. He was one of the most feared child murderers that the UK has ever known. He evaded capture for over a decade, and in doing so, helped to destroy the meaning of childhood for an entire generation of children. His modus operandi, the specific manner that he had of committing his crimes, was finely honed after years of abusing children, creating what criminologists call his signature. And he was literally caught in the act, but not before 4 young lives had been ended to satisfy his own sexual urges. But when he was initially arrested, he refused to confess to the police and was instead found guilty on the basis of an overwhelming array of evidence that was stacked against him. When he did finally speak, it was to the eminent sex offender therapist, Ray Wyre. What unfolded from their conversations was, with no exaggeration, some of the most chilling confessions by a paedophile in British criminal history. Seen for the first time, and in his own words, is the man whom I would describe as Britain's most deadly child killer. Who is he? Robert Black. In 1990, Robert Black was serving a life sentence in Saughton Prison, Scotland, for the attempted abduction of a 9-year-old schoolgirl in the Scottish border town of Stow. In a bid to have his sentence reduced, his defence team sought an expert witness for his appeal, in the form of the country's leading sex offender counsellor, Ray Wyre.
I don't know of any comparable set of circumstances. Those meetings, subsequent meetings between Ray and Robert Black, were extraordinary. They show Robert Black trying genuinely to understand what made him tick. They're incredibly graphic at times, they're harrowing, and I don't think I will ever get Robert Black's voice out of my mind. 20 years on, I can still hear it.
Tied her hands. Found a sticky plaster. Put the plaster over her mouth. Put that pillowcase or whatever it was, like cushion cover over her head. Put her into the sleeping bag. No, I just slung it in the corner.
Black was taking a huge gamble in offering Wyre an insight into the mechanisms of his mind. But it was a calculated one that he believed may be his only route to freedom.
There is always a case for trying to get to the bottom of the reasons for some horrific acts, and few could be more horrific than Black's. And one of the things that people ask time after time is, no, I understand what he did, but why? Why on earth did he do it? And one of the things that Black says in the Wyre interviews is, I don't really know.
I don't understand myself. I keep asking myself, why? I got this fascination or weakness or whatever I want to call it.
When Black and Wyre first met, the paedophile had only been charged with kidnapping and sexual assault on a minor.
He was only caught by accident. He abducted a girl in broad daylight in a little street in which opposite was a retired postmaster mowing his lawn. When he bent down to empty the box with the cuttings in it, he noticed a girl's legs disappearing into the air. They were clearly being placed in the back of a transit van. The postmaster was horrified, rushed into the house, the police were called, and then suddenly, driving back towards them, was the same transit van. A police officer steps in front of it, the van swerves, stops. Black is taken out of the van, and one of the officers discovers the girl hidden in a sleeping bag, tied, gagged, with a bag over her head. And the extraordinary coincidence is that the officer who discovered her discovered his own daughter. It was his daughter that had been abducted by Black. And the tragedy, of course, was that Black had already assaulted her. And it was only that complete coincidence that brought Black's career as an aggressive paedophile murderer to an end. But it was to be some time before he was actually convicted of any murder.
There was a growing suspicion that he was the culprit of a number of unsolved child murders that had puzzled police for over a decade.
Ray went up to Saughton Prison in Edinburgh and spent a total of 11 hours assessing Black in that initial session. He came away absolutely convinced that the life sentence was right. Black, he said, was an incredibly dangerous offender who needed to be in prison for the safety of children and the public.
Wyre's approach to talking and listening to sex offenders was both groundbreaking and controversial. But Wyre was convinced that it was only by talking to paedophiles that we could ever hope to curtail this most horrific form of criminal behaviour.
He was a bit soft and cuddly. He had this lovely, gentle voice, and he had all these little funny foibles, things that he'd do, like scratching his nose and things like that. You know, he had this permanent smile, so you didn't know what he was thinking. And that was part of his technique, I think. It was a natural, it was a talent. But when he was talking to his sex offenders, they wouldn't feel that he was challenging them or that he was accusatory in any way. He just sort of asked the questions, dum-de-dum-dum, you know. That was Ray, two halves of genius. And he was definitely that. He was a genius, yeah, way ahead of his time.
Wyre's skilled interviewing persona was soon eliciting information from Black that he had hitherto refused to share with anyone else. Unwanted by his own family, Wyre learned how Black was shunted from care home to care home until he ended up being fostered by the Tulip family.
At school, they used to call him Smelly Bobby Tulip because his personal hygiene could best be described as indistinct. He was a nasty, smelly, unhappy, rather strange little boy.
I remember one Christmas I didn't get no Christmas presents because I'd been bad. I got one present, somebody that lived out of town. It was a football. I can't remember what I'd done, you know, but she says Santa Claus isn't coming this year to you. And he didn't.
He developed very, very quickly, at a very early age, a fascination not only with his own genitalia, but also with the genitalia of girls. There is a story that at the age of 5, he manipulated a girl into showing him her genitalia, which only increased his fascination. And one of the fascinations, and one of the most chilling aspects of Black, was that he very quickly, and this is a very young age, between 5 and 8, he very quickly developed a habit of inserting things into himself, into his own anus, and into the vaginas of small girls he came in touch with. He was a deeply, deeply troubled child. In 1958, when Black was 11, both his foster parents, the Tulips, died. And he was relocated to another foster family who had a daughter. He could not stop himself interfering with the daughter of the house. He was sent to a very brutal care home, and Black was forced to perform sex acts on various members of the staff.
The pattern of child abuse that Black described to Wyre in the first interview suggested a precedent had been set. Many serial sex offenders have themselves been abused and frequently use this to excuse their behavior. This is sometimes called a technique of neutralization. From an early age, it was clear Black had found a way to satisfy his sexual urges and a way to disguise his crimes. With the trusting relationship between Wyre and Black intensifying, he began to open up about how these early experiences of molestation would escalate into abduction and then ultimately murder.
I remember one Christmas I didn't get no Christmas presents because I'd been bad. I got one present, somebody that lived out of town. It was a football. I can't remember what I'd done, you know, but she says Santa Claus isn't coming this year to you. And he didn't.
Michael, Robert Black talking to the sex therapist Ray Wyre. Again, one of the things that Black reveals to Ray Wyre is that Black himself was abused as a child. Have you personally ever worked with a paedophile that wasn't abused as a child?
Well, not all paedophiles will reveal the information about their early life history. They have to be in a particular setting to want to do that. So if they're in a therapeutic setting, they're much more likely to disclose their sort of early life experiences.
Don't you feel that sometimes, again, what we're hearing from Black is Black trying to create in the listener sympathy for Black?
I'm not sure that that's his motive. I think he's much more controlling around that. He's much more controlling in the information that he gives, and therefore it's to satisfy his own needs.
Even this idea that he didn't get any Christmas presents, Santa Claus isn't going to come to him this year, all those kinds of things that he reveals about his own childhood, which seem to me to be real techniques of neutralization. You know, these are permissions he's granting himself because of the trauma that he had as a child.
Sure, and so he's providing a rationale for why he's done what he's done, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he wants to elicit sympathy from the interviewer.
In his interview with Ray Wyre, Black reveals how in 1963, when he was just 16 years old, his soft voice and mild manner enabled him to develop his deadly craft.
It's in the park in Greenock, at the swings. And all the other kids had gone except for the one little girl. And I asked her if she wanted to see, let's say, kitten. I knew where there was kittens.
The voice of Robert Black could be, in fact, the voice of a child entertainer, of a child storyteller. It was a voice that probably had evolved and developed in talking, charming children, in engaging children, in not frightening off children. It's probably why his voice sends a chill down the back of most people.
She came with me. And as we were going into it was an air raid shelter, she said it was dark. She wanted to get out again. She started to cry.
Because of the way Black described things, for Ray it felt like he was there with him in that air raid shelter or wherever he was, and Ray, that was a unique experience. Not pleasant, but a unique experience in which he could be with Robert Black as he's, squeezing this child's throat.
I think I clapped my hand over her mouth, held her down on the ground with my hand round her throat, and holding her down. And she must have gone unconscious anyway. And I masturbated there. And went out, left her. You didn't know that she was alive or dead? No.
He fondled her, which was the phrase used at that time, but he was not prosecuted. He was, in the phrase, admonished. All that did was give Black an excuse. No one really minded what he did. No one was too concerned. Well, I can get away with it.
Black moved to London to find work as a van driver. On his journeys, he noticed the seedy sex shops along the Caledonian Road. In the pre-internet age, they would become his portal to the evil world he would come to completely inhabit.
There was a place where I used to go to get, where I first discovered the chap, a shop down near King's Cross in London. Didn't have a name, it was just like a shop front, and you went in and it was like old books lined up, but you wanted to get something else. You went in the back.
He would go to the sex shop and there was always something more. He would ask, "You have anything about teenagers?" which was shorthand or cipher for children.
That was all child pornography. No, I made the chance remark. I said, had he any like teenage sex magazines? He says, I've got these, and he hauled them out. They're called lollytots.
As time goes on, he became a more and more regular customer. The shop owner would allow him to move further and further into the shop. And as you go into the back of these shops, that's where the hardcore child porn and things like that were kept. But it was kind of a process where you had to be accepted, you had to be talking the right language to be moved up to a higher level of porn.
In my mind, the ideal situation would be a child that was completely willing and eager. Somebody once said to me that their motto was, when they're big enough, they're old enough. I tended to agree with that. Somebody once said to me that their motto was, when they're big enough, they're old enough. I tended to agree with that.
An impossible question for you to answer, Michael, but I'm asking you nonetheless. Why do people become sexually attracted to children? What is it that attracts them to children?
What is it that attracts anybody to anybody else? It's some of the things that it just happens. You were attracted to your wife, I was attracted to my wife. Other people are attracted to individuals of the same gender. Some individuals are attracted to older individuals, others are attracted to younger individuals. What's important in those contexts is to be able to control your sexual impulses and behaviour in cases where it's clearly not appropriate to engage in that sort of relationship.
The word paedophile is incredibly totalising, though, isn't it? And yet Black has a particular type that he's interested in.
I mean, generally, sort of paedophilia refers to a sexual attraction to young individuals, be it boys or be it girls. But with Robert Black, it was young girls.
And not only young girls, but young girls who were willing. He has this idea that his preferred victim would actually be almost complicit.
Well, that may have been a desire, but actually he abducted girls who weren't willing. So the motivation was to abduct and to have a sexual relationship with, or at least a sexual activity with, a young girl.
I'd be driving along, I'd see a young girl, I'd get out and talk to her and try to persuade her to get into the van and take her somewhere quiet.
Black secured a job delivering posters nationwide. As a sexual predator, he now had the perfect means by which to explore the country and seek out young victims.
This was ideal for him because he didn't have a boss over him. Long as he delivered the goods in the right place at roughly the right time, he was allowed to do what he wants when he wanted. And this gave him the opportunity to go looking for children, which he did. He would go to parks, he would observe children, try and see the ones that were on their own so that he could make contact with them.
As the interviews progressed, Wyre's laid-back approach was eliciting ever-increasing detail from Black about his M.O.
Coming up from like from Wimbledon way, like up through Wandsworth, heading home. How old was she? Looked about 10. She went into the side streets and the back streets. I followed and I was out of the van. And she screamed and ran.
One of the most noticeable aspects of Robert Black's killing was they were done during the summer holidays, July, August, when children are more vulnerable. They're left out playing, the evenings are lighter, they're left on their own more with other young children. He took the opportunity, time and time again, to kill during the summer holiday.
He would literally sit beside playgrounds watching the children and seeing if one of the girls was less, how can one put it, less looked after than the others. He would befriend the loner, or the one who seemed to have been abandoned, or the one who wasn't quite with anyone.
If he saw someone he thought of as a suitable victim, he would assess very, very carefully the circumstances. He would double back, he would drive round, he would check what's the likelihood of me being caught. And if it was clear to him that he could do this and not be caught, he would grab the child, bundle her into the back of a van and take her away to abuse and ultimately to kill her.
It was a tactic that he used with, in the end, devastating effect. He developed a series of really quite appalling techniques. He would put elastoplast or sicking plaster over the child's mouth after having put his hand across it. He would tie her up. He would put her into a sleeping bag. He would tie her legs. He would put a hood over her head. He would pull the sleeping bag over her head, because that way she became literally his prey.
He had a crime kit. He would have a sleeping bag, he would put the child in the sleeping bag, he would rape the child several times, tie them up, and then eventually strangle them and dispose of the body. It's suspected on several occasions he actually went back to the bodies, but we don't know whether he just masturbated over them or whether he engaged in other sexual activities.
It's painful to say it, but so many times in Black's life, the victims would have been kept alive for at least some hours. It is horrific even to consider what they may have suffered at his hands.
One of Ray Wyre's skills as an interviewer was never to pass judgment or admonish. It was an approach that worked, encouraging Black to disclose his twisted logic.
He had this really weird idea, and again it's in total denial and diminishing of what he was doing, was he wanted people to believe, and I think he wanted to believe it himself, that in strangling a child and making her unconscious, he would somehow not be hurting her. So that's something that kept cropping up in the interviews. I didn't want to hurt her, but he'd render her unconscious. So surely to get to even that stage, she would have had to suffer. But that's what he wanted, certainly Ray to believe, and that's what he tried to believe himself.
It seems strange, but you don't want to hurt children if they die. But in her dying, you said that you didn't want her to suffer. Whatever you were going to do, you didn't want her to be in pain. There's sometimes, think about being unconscious rather than or drunk or drugged or something like that.
A sex abuser has to distort his thinking and his belief to give himself permission to abuse. Hearing it from Black, Ray learnt just how far a man had to go, an offender has to go to get to that point. I think he always knew just how offenders could distort their thinking, but I don't think he'd ever seen it used quite so horrifically. I think it's an insight into how they think, the language they use in order to justify, to minimise, to deny. We need to get hold of that language.
One of the reasons Black evaded capture for so long was that the children he abducted and murdered were often dumped hundreds of miles from their homes.
Most killers dispose of the body as quickly as possible to create a larger window between when they dispose of the body and then when they're investigated by the police. But he didn't dispose of the body near the site where he found the victim. He would often drive 200-300 miles away and then dispose of the body. And he had favourite stops on his routes from London to Northern Ireland to Scotland, where he would have a break. Taking a body hundreds of miles is a very unusual activity. It also shows that he wanted to be connected with the child. He'd obviously sexually assaulted them, killed the child, but he still wanted to have that connection with the child.
Black's confessions to Wyre were about to take another deadly turn. Because of his MO, and especially because of his signature, he'd long been suspected of murdering other children. And shortly before he died, he was to be charged with the death of Devonshire schoolgirl Jeanette Tate. Wyre and others had long suspected Black of being involved in Jeanette's abduction, and he invited him to offer any insight he might have about her disappearance.
What's going on? Don't, maybe there was that paper girl went missing. Tate? Yeah, that's her name. Yeah. She disappeared, she never turned up.
Most serial killers are to some degree narcissistic. Robert Black was no exception. He could be lured, as it were, into revealing information by, as it were, appealing to his ego and to actually ask his opinion of this girl and how he would treat her. He would spill the beans that little bit too far and reveal information that could only be known to the killer.
And how did you think he did it? Well, they found her bike, didn't they? Yeah. Which obviously either persuaded her to get off her bike or grabbed her off the bike, one of the two. Got her into a vehicle and took her away. Why do you believe that? It seemed obvious, didn't it? Yeah.
By now, Wyre was convinced Black was a multiple murderer, but knowing he was not about to make a full confession, he tried a different tactic.
Ray was, one of his techniques was assumption making. So he would interview, but he'd make an assumption of what happened next. And so the person being interviewed would just assume he knew and respond accordingly. Because at that point he wouldn't be able to say, he was no longer in control in the sense of the interview. That's what Ray did.
When you thought about Tate, what feelings did it give you when you thought about him doing it? I think that's like how I started off with the scenario. Yeah. What would you do? Same, if I've seen a paper bill, like maybe park and watch for a while. Yeah. See what sort of route. Getting myself in a position where it would be possible to take somebody. There was that paper girl went missing. Tate? Yeah, that's her name. Yeah. She disappeared, she never turned up.
I was intrigued by Ray Wyre questioning Black about the abduction of Jeanette Tate. And Black's widely suspected of having abducted that little girl. Were you surprised by how Black responds to the kinds of questions Wyre puts to him?
No, because most serial offenders will want to hold back information. They will want to be in control of certain elements. Now, if it is clear that they've been convicted, perhaps, or if it's very apparent that who it was that they killed, then actually they know that they can talk around that. But if there is confusion or uncertainty, then they can hold that back and be in control of that information, knowing that others want it and being able to almost have it as part of a ransom, really.
But isn't it interesting that Ray Wyre uses Jeanette Tate's name? Black depersonalizes everything that he says, whilst nonetheless revealing his MO.
He reveals how it is that he carries out certain attacks, and that's very explicit, and that gives us that understanding of his modus operandi, of his reason for operating. But he doesn't want to confess to the killing of Tate. He wants to hold that back. He wants it in case he wants to use it at a later stage for his own purposes.
However, despite discussing aspects of his crimes, Black wasn't revealing the full extent of them.
I think I clapped my hand over her mouth and held her down on the ground with my hand round her throat and holding her down. She must have gone unconscious anyway. And I masturbated there. Went out, left her.
Until his final days, Black tried to explain away his crimes. When killers choose to confess, they can often be candid, but their aim is to generate our sympathy for them. They, of course, feel none for their victims. They have no genuine empathy. Robert Black's confessions provide a chilling insight into the mind of a murderer and a reminder of how serial murderers follow patterns that allow every killer to create their own deadly and unmistakable signature.
This pattern of behaviour is based on the idea that the sexual interest objects are literally objects, not human beings, and that this carves a way of dealing with other people whereby their own sexual satisfaction is the major thing in their lives and the major important thing in achieving these engagements with children. They're not, as it were, charming a child, taking them away to actually engage them in some kind of relationship. They are just simply objects to be what they want them to be so that they can gain sexual satisfaction, not with that person, but using that person.
There was a girl on her own in the flats when I was delivering. And I sit down and talk to her for a few minutes later. We try and touch her. Sometimes succeeded, sometimes not.
He treats them as an object. They're not sentient people. They're not a little girl. They are just objects for his sexual satisfaction.
It happened fairly right.
Okay. So you don't know how many children?
It could be in the 30s, 40s.
In the case of Jeanette Tate, he would begin to talk about it, and then that would be dropped. And that might be dropped for 1 or 2 sessions, and then picked up again in the next one, and then again the one after. And it's only when you assemble the tiny fragments of what he said about Jeanette Tate that you begin to understand what Black was trying to hint at, but was never, ever going to confess to.
Upon Black's arrest for child abduction in 1990, police forces around the country began to pool their resources. Before long, he became the prime suspect in a series of unsolved child murders that had spanned over a decade.
Robert Black, in common with many serial killers, realizes that at the point where you're arrested and you are not likely to be let go, you are now powerless. You are going to be told what to do with the rest of your life. Therefore, any piece of power, any kind of sense of control over others is absolutely vital to them. And they will almost always withhold some information. Providing that information is of value to someone else, they can feel that they are in a position of power and will sometimes take that information to the grave.
They then got in the van. Yeah, but they were in the front, sitting up on the seat. You've got to be honest with me, Robert. Got to be. What year is this? Say 85, 86.
One of the things you do is you try and work out what their style is. Some people, you appeal to their intelligence. Some people, you appeal to their humanity. Sometimes you have to be a father confessor and play the role of just almost listening and letting somebody tell their story slowly, and just every now and then put in a question to check the information and allow them to talk. And it's played by different people at different levels at different times. But the aim is to get as much of the truth as possible. We never get the whole truth, partly because the killer doesn't know the whole truth themselves. They haven't come to reality of what they've done.
They then got in the van. Yeah, but they were in the front, sitting off on the seat. You've got to be honest with me, Robert. Got to be. What year is this? It's 85, 86.
One of the things that interests me in those tapes is the sense in which Wyre doesn't judge Black. People hearing that tape, and you and I have interviewed many, many paedophiles, why don't we react to some of the things they tell us?
Because if we did, then there's a likelihood that they will stop disclosing.
Michael, both you and I are very publicly identified with the cause of offender prison rehabilitation. Robert Black, could he have been rehabilitated?
I think it's highly unlikely. I think we have to recognise that for certain individuals, rehabilitation is probably not a possibility, and therefore it's a question of how best do you look after them.
Robert Black died in prison in 2016, just days before he was to be charged with the abduction and murder of Jeanette Tate from some 30 years previously. That final charge laid against him was foreshadowed some 20 years earlier during Ray Wyre's ingenious questioning of Black about the schoolgirl's disappearance.
I suppose the only way a parent could prevent something like that happening is keep the child tied to the apron string all the time, like, you know, virtually put them on a lead, never let them out of their sight. It wasn't their fault, like they couldn't have done nothing about it.
Even to this day, Ray Wyre's remarkable interviews with Black continue to fuel debate, not least of all as to the question, was redemption ever possible?
He thought Black wasn't redeemable. Yeah. It was too well practiced, too well rehearsed. It was part of who he was. Yeah, he was unloved, you know. He was pushed from pillar to post. He was rejected. There was no role model for him. So, and there were lots of missed opportunities to salvage him when he was salvageable. So he just went on and on and on and on until, you know, this was going to happen. He was going to live this life. So could he be redeemed after having murdered so many little girls? No, I don't think so.
Those tapes, those sessions showed how, if you're prepared to spend the time and effort, you can understand, we can understand why a man like Black develops into a serial child sex killer.